I always say this is the time where I have to behave and act like a professional when it's recorded.
Time to behave, Lacey.
I know who wants to behave. Well, we're so excited that you're here today. My name's Lacey Jungman. I am a consultant and certified working genius facilitator. Zandra?
Likewise, I am a facilitator as well. I also do some executive coaching, and shortest way to say it is organizational health, right? Making sure that there's good communication, good alignment amongst teams, particularly leadership teams. And so the topic that, or the topic we're covering today will lend itself really well to that. So if you want, Lacey, I can go into our next slide here.
Perfect. So, as just a set of housekeeping rules, Xandra is going to keep an eye on the waiting list for us, and we will both take turns managing and looking over the chat. So, if you have questions that come up, go ahead and throw them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we're paying attention to that. And as newcomers join us a little bit late, because we know how Wednesdays can be, we all might be running late for meetings, that we'll be sure to reinforce that as well. If, in fact, because this is a productivity session that we're talking about, we want to maximize our time here. If we run out of time or we don't get to your question, there will be an opportunity to connect with us through a couple QR codes where you can book some time on our calendars so that you can get those questions answered in a more specific way for you. So on our roadmap today, where we're going to go is we're going to talk about the 6 types of working genius model created by Patrick Lencioni and the Table Group. So some of you may be familiar with the concept or the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. It's a great leadership book. If you haven't read that, add that and the Working Genius to your to be read list. And I think that those are really, really great nuggets of information. But really, that 5 dysfunctions of a team talks about the foundation of a healthy team being rooted in trust. And so today's session is not only in lean into productivity and team synergy, but really is also complementary to that trust building of a team. Once we understand not only how we work, but how our team members operate, we can better build that trust. So we'll talk high level about individual assessments, individual impacts of the working genius for each and every one of us, what that might look like, and then how that translates to a team and how we can create our own team mapping exercise. So with that, let's talk about what the heck is working genius. And I love thinking about this from a variety of angles. One, what I want you to know is this model is really, if we were to break it up into percentages, the working genius model is really about 20% personality assessment, where you're learning the behaviors, what drives you, how are you wired, and about 80% productivity model, right? So it's more of a productivity tool that helps you to not only layer on your behaviors and your skill sets, but how do we function as a team? So it really unites both individuals and team members for one common goal, which is productivity and outcomes. And I want you to think of, as Xandra walks us through the actual model, I'm kind of giving some context to you in the back of your brain here before she walks us through it. I want you to think of really, there's 6 types of steps that have to happen in order to get work done. And as she explains it, you may be thinking, oh gosh, like I'm good at all of these things. But this is really what we're talking about is a ranking, not a rating. This is more of not, yes, I'm good at this. No, I'm not good at that. It's a ranking of like, what brings me the most joy? I might be skilled and good at all of these things, but what gives me the most joy at the very top of that ranking to all the way at the bottom of what kind of drains me? And so I'm going to use this analogy, and probably a good time to cascade towards that next slide of what a genius is in terms of thinking of pouring coffee, because I am on, is probably like my fourth cup here today, as you can probably very well tell. But I want you to think of these 6 different stages or steps that have to happen in order to get work done. Through an assessment process, you'll be able to identify 2 areas of your working genius, 2 areas of working competency, and 2 of working frustration. And so essentially, your working genius are 2 steps within this 6-step framework that Xandra will explain that really energize you. You're good at it. It comes natural. It brings you joy and fulfillment. And if you were to do these tasks for the majority of the day, you would still leave on an energy high because you're loving what you're doing. It fills your bucket. And it could really be comparable to pouring coffee into a Yeti mug, right? So if we think about, I pour coffee at 8 a.m. into my Yeti mug, it's got a lid, it's stainless steel. If I drink that now, or I drink it 3 hours later, that coffee is going to be piping hot. That is essentially the same as your working genius. That coffee stays hot, that energy stays full. You are thriving and energized. Now, I want you to think, as Xandra explains these 6 steps, about your working competency. Working competencies are things that kind of fill your bucket. You're kind of good at it. But, if you did it for too long, it might kind of drain you. It doesn't really fill your excitement and your bucket as much as your working genius. And so I want you to think about this as comparable to, maybe it's the same Yeti mug, but I don't have a lid on it. If I drink it today at 8 a.m. and I drink it at 11 a.m., it's not going to be hot. It's going to have cooled off, right? And so over time, it kind of cools off and you don't love what you're doing. Then we think about what our working frustrations are. And I want you to think about a styrofoam cup that has no lid, that is not stainless steel. And by the way, it has a hole in the bottom and it drains. That is your working frustration. It drains the energy out of you. And if you're doing it way too long or for any amount of time, you can end up burnt out. You can feel frustrated. You can feel as though you don't love your job and you just feel this inner disconnect with your job. So that's really the working frustration area. You might be okay with it. You might do well at it, but it doesn't give you the joy and fulfillment that your working genius gives you. So that's kind of a quick overview. And I love that Xandra has the coffee mugs in her background because it is very appropriate for this analogy. And I will segue to her to kind of explain what these 6 functions of the working genius model are.
Awesome. Thank you, Lacey. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. Thank you. I think that was a very, very good setup of what the working genius is. And really, I mean, the topic for today is team synergy and team productivity. And so one tool, one mechanism that we can definitely leverage in that arena is this framework of the working genius. But I will ask that we kind of keep that in the back of our mind, right? Is how can we apply this to a team? Because the working genius, if you know anything about me, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and you may sense a theme, if you know me at all, or if you don't, I'm sharing this with you, is I really love and gravitate towards simplicity and depth, because I think some of the most meaningful things can be very simple. They just have very deep layers. And that is when I was deciding, and Lacey, I'd be really curious to hear from you too, if there was anything here, is I was going through all of the assessments under the sun, trying to figure out, okay, what's a good fit? What is something that I can get behind and I can share with people? What jumped out at me about the working genius was its simplicity. You get a very easy to understand and digest report. You can apply it at an individual level. You can apply it to projects at work. You can even apply it in your family life. So there's even instances of how can this, and I know that the table group who developed this framework is even developing something for teenagers / young adults, is the earlier that we can get in and actually understand how our brains work can open up a world of possibilities of, oh, that's why this type of task at school doesn't come as easy to maybe this child versus this child. So again, I'm sharing all of this just to give you a little tip of the iceberg of how profound these concepts can really be, even though on paper they're pretty black and white, but actually understanding them and putting them into effect can make a really big difference. So I might just pause there because I'm really curious, Lacey, when you decided to get certified as a facilitator for the Working Genius, kind of what was behind that? Like drove you to that? And sorry, like in fairness to Lacey, I didn't prep her for that. It just popped into my head. I'm like really curious what.
Oh, listen, I love a good popcorn question. So you can toss them over to me anytime. I will say, growing up, my mom was a DISC and Gallup Strength Finder certified coach. And so she raised me to know myself really well. In fact, anytime a boy would come to pick me up for a date, she would come waving her assessments because she always said to me, I want you to date your opposite because they will balance you. You are way out here and you need to have your balance of opposite over here. And I did, in fact, actually end up marrying my complete opposite. So, but what she would always say to me is that you could take all the assessments in the world, and if you do nothing with them or don't apply some sort of strategy based on that knowledge, all you've done is label people. And so I think about that in my own mind. And when I read this, or actually I first heard about this, a friend of mine had commented on LinkedIn about, oh, this was a great book. And I'm always looking for a good book, especially professional and personal development rolled into one. Sign me up. So I read the book and I'm like, oh, God, this is good. Like, this is good because it's practical application, not just labeling. And so that to me was like, I've got to do this more because I recognize the immense benefit that my mom gave me by helping me to know who I was and how I was wired and to not feel so much guilt about I should be this way. I should do this. Sally's over there crushing it and I'm over
Yeah.
here like not. And so comparisonitis really can get the best of us, even as adults today. And so that was one thing for me. Like, I want to empower other people to know how they're wired because it gives them more confidence. And oftentimes, whether you're a man or woman, but I work a lot with women, especially working moms, we struggle sometimes with that confidence, and knowing ourselves gives us that power of like, hey, this is who I am, and I embrace who I am and how I was wired.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I did not know that about your mom and that she had that background and those certifications. That's really interesting. I would pay money to see her like chasing a boy down the street with assessments like, come here.
I mean, I will say
What are your strengths?
it did lead to a breakup. It was like, yeah. So anyways,
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. So jumping back into kind of this framework and how it all comes together is one of the many things that I really, really like is these are the 6 buckets, if you will, of geniuses that exist. And whether by design or by coincidence, they wind up spelling out the word widget, which it took me a while to actually realize that, right? It's like WIDGET. It actually spells out widget, which is one of those levels of the profound application of this because like I said, it can work for an individual. It can also work for a team. It can also work for a project. So Lacey alluded to this in her intro a little bit, is each one of us is going to have, of these 6, 2 of them are going to stand out as our geniuses or our strengths, things that we love to do, things that energize us. 2 of them are going to be essentially the opposite of that, meaning things that we don't enjoy doing, they don't come naturally to us, and they're actually draining. Like they're probably the contributing factors of how you can get to the end of a workday and just be like spent because they drain your energy. And then you've got 2 in the middle that are your competencies, meaning, yes, you can do them. You probably can't do them for a long time. And therefore, they're not necessarily energizing you. And they're probably actually not the best use of the majority of your time, just because they're not your levels of genius. So if you have interest in taking the assessment, we can also share about a little bit about how you can do that at the end of this course. But I will go really high level into each one of these just to give you a little bit of a taste of what each of these means. So the genius of wonder is really that beginning question of like, could we do this better? Should we be doing this? Is there something else we should be doing? Are we missing something? So it's really just that curiosity of, is there a different way to do this? And then that can drive these other various geniuses. Invention is, once there is that question, coming up with the ideas of all the things that could be done. And mind you, I will point out for the genius of invention, it doesn't necessarily mean that all ideas are great. Lacey, is one of your geniuses invention? Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, like I would be really curious here too, is are all your ideas great?
I mean, I like to think they are. Um, no, but honestly, the genius of invention is it's my favorite thing to do. Like I could spend all day in a room brainstorming with people. I
Yeah.
have a good girlfriend who gets panicked when she goes into a strategy meeting because she has to bring her brainstorming skills and she's tenacity. And we're going to get into that in a minute, but
Yeah.
it is so fun for me, but not fun for her. And so when I come into a brainstorming meeting, even if it's not technically a brainstorming meeting, I'll come with a bunch of ideas that can somewhat be overwhelming to people. So I've had to learn to control that genius.
Yeah. 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 Perfect. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Because um, there is a time and a place for us to use all of our geniuses, whether it's in a given meeting, during the course of a given project, um, and depending on the audience, like there's a lot of factors. So just because we have these geniuses and just because they are the areas that we shine, number one, yes, we want to lean into them and we want to thrive in those areas, but also we need to know when they're not appropriate, right? So if you're towards the end of a project and you're already ready to launch it, that's probably not the best time to say, oh, I wonder if we could do that better, right? Like that's just going to throw a monkey wrench in the whole process. So wonder, invention, discernment is really kind of poking holes in that invention, right? So Lacey came up with all these great ideas. Awesome. I actually have the genius of discernment. So I can come in and I can start asking questions. Well, what happens down the line when XYZ is going on? And then it's the moment of refinement with that discernment. Assuming we get past that stage, then we've come up with a finished product or really close to what our finished product would be. Then it goes into that stage of galvanizing, right? And I'm showing the example, especially as it might relate to a project, right? Like, okay, is there a better way than horse and carriage to get around? Oh, like maybe we could have a flying vehicle. Maybe we could have a vehicle that still leverages wheels and somehow we can power it. Oh, okay. How would we do that? We go into discernment. And then once we've got that idea nailed down, then it's galvanizing, which is really just rallying the troops. Um, Rallying the troops to around that idea and how we can do things better. And then it goes into enablement. And enablement is getting things out of the way, right? Removing blockers, making people's jobs easier to do is really what enablement is essentially. And then the very last stage of work, and also one of the geniuses, is tenacity. It's that getting it done, getting it across the finish line, working through all of those details. So that is the working genius in a nutshell. So I'm just taking a quick look at the chat to make sure we don't have questions. I know, Lacey, you're monitoring that too. But I will go ahead and go into the stages of work and how that translates. So this slide, and I believe the one coming up too, will all have sort of different aspects of this same widget. So we're still going through what these geniuses mean, and then maybe just looking at it through a slightly different lens. So the difference here really is if we look at the very bottom of the slide, we've got ideation, activation, implementation. Think about each of these geniuses as they're working in tandem, how they can sort of team up and provide like an uptick to the prior stage, meaning wonder and invention create a loop that is essentially ideation. So it's okay, so we've got a horse and carriage. I wonder if we can do that better. And then it's the stage of thinking like, oh, okay, is it the flying vehicle? Is it a vehicle on the ground? Is it a vehicle on tracks? That is the invention stage, right? But both of those together, the question and the invention come together for that stage of ideation. Likewise, if we kind of go to the next stage and we look at discernment and galvanizing, that's the activation stage. That's the poking the holes and rallying the troops. It's a critical component of effectiveness amongst project teams, across organizations, and it's really easily overlooked. So I really like to call out attention to this middle stage. A very, very good example that has been shared here, because the table group that came up with this framework actually worked with Nike and some of their leadership team. And what they realized is like they were actually missing this whole middle component of their stages of work. They had people in a room coming up with all these great shoes and inventive products. And then they were like flopping it over the fence at the people that are actually making the shoe. And the projects were falling flat on their face. And so what they came to learn is like there was nothing in the middle to say like, oh, is this really like the best type of shoe? Like, is there a market for this? Is this going to be cost effective to make? Like, there wasn't that middle activation stage. They were skipping it completely. And so all they were doing was just failing more than was necessary if they would have like pumped the brakes and thought about that section. So I think that's a really important thing to point out here in this particular lens that we're looking through the stages of work, how each one has a different component. Like each organization, each project, even each individual job is going to have these geniuses to some extent. It's really how we apply them and the awareness in each situation and how we maybe regulate those things. And then I am going to jump over here into yet a different lens of, again, the same geniuses, but dividing. And you see that little dotted line, and we've got responsive up top and disruptive on the bottom. Really what that essentially means is if we're looking at the top row, that responsive, it's coming as a result of something else, meaning the genius of wonder comes across when something is discovered, when someone comes across it and really asks themselves that question of, could we do this better? But it's reacting to something else. Another prompt, an external prompt, is driving that particular genius. And the same thing with discernment, right? Like you can't poke holes in an idea if there is no idea. So the discernment is really coming as a result of that prior step in this whole framework, which is discernment responding to invention. And the same thing, enablement and galvanizing, it's that same thing is, okay, we've got the rallying of the troops. Now, how do we make the troops' jobs easier? That's that station or that genius of enablement. And then on the bottom, we've got the more disruptive geniuses, if you will, like coming up with all the ideas, rallying the troops, getting things across the finish line. And each one of those geniuses, whether it is responsive or it is disruptive, has its own place, has its own benefit. And that's really where the magic lies, right? Is just the awareness. Because just the fact that an idea comes up doesn't necessarily mean it's a great idea. So if we're jumping from that idea stage all the way to the tenacity stage, like, great, let's get it done. Great, let's move on. We're missing some critical components. Likewise, if individuals have these geniuses, it can impact how we show up. So I'll give you an example. My specific geniuses are discernment and enablement. If you notice, both of those are responsive geniuses. And I can even share, like I'll share it here in a little bit once we get into the guilt and judgment, but just that awareness of this is how my brain works. I respond to other things. I'm not the one that's going in there and rallying the troops and really being disruptive. That's not who I am, but that is not necessarily a bad thing. Before we kind of move into this next phase, I'm curious, Lacey, if you have any other comments or questions, anything that pops out at you.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I want to address the enablement piece of it because I think we've been conditioned to think that enablement is a negative concept. If you think about, oh gosh, I enabled my children to, just to keep asking for more help, or this person's in trouble, and so I enable them to continue with that behavior. We hear enablement as a negative concept so much in our life, but that is not what it is here. So I want to clarify that. Anybody who has enablement is literally responding to the galvanizer. So when we talk about responsive versus disruptive, we can go back to the W&I and explain why each of them. Wonder is responding to their environment. Invention is responding to the questions, right? Discernment is responding to the ideas, galvanizing to the decision. Enablement, though, responds not to the idea. They respond to the galvanizer. They are connected personally. It is that response of I'm here to help. And so I want to really clarify that if anybody has enablement or you're thinking, gosh, that's probably my working genius, that it's not a bad thing. And I think we also have this negative connotation of responsive. Oh, I'm not proactive. I'm responsive or reactive. And that's not it at all. What we're talking about is in certain context of environment and our conditions and our teams. So we think about responsive. I'm wonder. I respond to my environment. Discernment responds to the person, right? Who is coming up with the ideas, and enablement responds to the person, the galvanizer. And as we think of disruptive, we're disrupting our existing environment or our teams. Galvanizers are often disrupting teams, like the team cohesion, because it seemed as like, oh, I'm bristling. This is, you want me to go this direction, and you have all of these, parameters for me. Galvanizing has to have all of the information in order to get the team directly going the direction that they need. And so
Mhm.
they are disrupting the team in a sense,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
not negative. So I think if we take these preconceived notions that we have about enablement and disruption and just think anew with that. These are words that we've been conditioned to pursue, right? And that we think we know. But in this context, enablement is not bad. It's such a
Mhm.
gift. I wish I had it. I
Yeah.
don't. It is my frustration, actually. And I'm grateful for people who have that because they enable my galvanizing and they get
Right.
legs under an idea. Essentially, enablement is getting the legs under that idea that we're pursuing already, and tenacity takes it through the finish line. And that oftentimes people are like, oh, tenacity, like, how is that disruptive? Because they're just, and I don't want to say just, they are fulfilling the idea and they are the implementers of it and making action. But so often we get stuck in, well, we really don't have to see it through to that far. And the person with tenacity is like, no, 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 we're stopping everything until this project is done and seen through completion. And so tenacity is actually a disruptor. And that's pretty cool to see, because a lot of times we think, well, they're finishing out a project, so it's basically responding to the idea of it.
Mhm.
No, they are disrupting their environment by saying stop at all costs so that we can get this completed. And that's where productivity happens, is where everybody is playing their own role in this. I
Mhm.
thought you did a fantastic job explaining it.
Yeah, no, and thank you for saying that because a couple of things actually came up like as you were going through that. It was like little ideas popped into my head, or like just reminders, right? Because I think we were talking about even before we started this session is there's the ability to go down a rabbit hole with this framework because there are so many layers of depth. And being cognizant of that, just wanting to make sure that we only share the things that really will serve the most amount of people and be really easy to digest. But a couple of things that came up as you were going through that, Lacey, is number one, from an individual perspective, it's really easy for us to, and it's not only easy, but very common for us to downplay whatever our geniuses are, right? So like minor discernment and enablement. Awesome. I'm not at the beginning, like I'm not asking poignant questions. I'm not coming up with these great ideas. I'm also not the type that is really passionate about getting things through the finish line, right? So like I can find all the ways to poke holes in the geniuses that I have. There are also things that come easy to me, right? So if it's easy for me to poke holes or it's easy for me to remove blockers from other people, then I downplay it. Like, oh, that's not a big deal. That's easy, right? Like, but it's easy for me. And the opposite of that, just like you shared, Lacey, like enablement is not one of yours. You wish you had it, right? The same way I wish I had invention, but it's because they don't come naturally to us. So there's sometimes a lack of appreciation of like, they're called geniuses for a reason. So kind of shifting that mindset to say, no, like this is actually something very powerful. If I spend more time and energy focused in the areas where I really thrive, I'm going to be so much more effective, so much more productive. And bonus, if I know that my partner in crime, Lacey, has complementary geniuses to mine, like let's get together. Let's do these projects together, and we're going to be able to leverage each other's geniuses, which is really that magic recipe in the productivity and effectiveness of a team. So that was one thing that came up. The other one too, which I think is really helpful to note, is whenever you have a leader in a team, that leader's geniuses and their frustrations are magnified. Like I would even say like tenfold over. So if we're in a situation, Lacey, you and we're reporting to someone else, and that particular person has the geniuses of wonder and galvanizing, most of the conversations, unless that person is aware of it, most of the conversations, most of the meetings, most of the focus is probably going to be within those geniuses. Like I've heard Pat Lencioni say something, what was it? When you're a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And that really resonated because it's true, is like when those are our geniuses, that's the lens that we see everything through. And particularly it's important for the leader of a team to be aware of their own geniuses and how that impacts not only themselves but their whole team, and that they're amplifying and have like a really big impact on the people around them. So like I said, I could go down rabbit holes and talk forever. I don't want to I don't want to do that. So I will hand the baton back over to you, Lacey, as we kind of go through the rest of our session.
I think that's a perfect segue because as we have thought about this for individually, yes, you can take the assessment, but it's pretty cut and clear sometimes for many of us to know exactly which ones are our working genius. Like, yes, we thrive and we get energized by these certain areas of genius, and these areas really do not fulfill us. I didn't have to take the assessment to know which one would be my frustration. That I knew hands down. And so what's really fascinating though is leveraging the knowledge and information inside of your own teams. And so what I want to do is throw up a sample team map here. This is a sample team map that we've assessed here not too long ago. And by the average look of it, and you may or may not be able to see this, I know some of you are on your phones, but I'll describe it for you. Each of the 6 functions of work, WIDGET, lists on one hand, on the left side, a genius, everybody within this 7-person team who has the genius in that area. And everybody on that 7-person team who has the frustration of that specific working genius. And so by first glance at this, we're thinking, oh, okay, well, this seems to be a pretty balanced team, right? Because there are genius and frustration on every single function of which work needs to get done, right? So every one of those 6 points has people who have it as a genius, cool, and have it as a frustration, normal. However, at closer look with this, I want you to pay attention. And this is just an example of a team map, but why it's valuable and important is really reading between the layers here. What we see is really glaring for me is that end portion of implementation. So if we look, the very first thing to me that's most important is looking at implementation and tenacity towards the bottom there. You see in each of those, there's only 2 people who have it as a working genius, and enablement has a lot of people who have it as a frustration. And so what happens in a team like this, where they're heavy in invention, you can see several geniuses. What is that? 5 geniuses of invention and 5 geniuses in discernment, is that we come up with a lot of ideas. Like, cool, we're coming up with a lot of ideas. And yet we're also discerning those ideas because there's a lot of people. And what can happen is we can get stuck in that analysis paralysis, right? By saying, well, I'm discerning it this way, or I think we need to do it this way. And so we can come to almost a halt on any decision because we have so many people looking at it from different lenses, and we stop with the discernment because if it gets too hard or too frustrating. Again, why the 5 dysfunctions of a team comes in helpful, right? We have to be able to trust one another, have clear communication, commitment, buy-in, all of the things in order to see results. However, in this situation, we often see that productivity can stall because we're constantly going back and forth with all these people who love inventing and all of them who love discerning, and we don't actually see it happening and coming through the finish line. And that finish line is really important for enablement and tenacity. And with only 2 people having those as geniuses, that tells me that we probably have a lot of ideas that are not seen through the finish line. And Xandra, I'm not sure if you see that same thing when you look at this, but I see the concern being so much frustration with enablement and so much frustration with galvanizing. So if we do a good job finally discerning which ideas we're going to fulfill and pursue, there's friction instantly with galvanizing. The 3 poor people who love galvanizing and they're naturally good at it and they get energy by it are seen with frustration by the bulk of the team who really doesn't want anything to do with that. So they may look at it as it's not their strength, they don't want to do it, or they may also look at it as a challenge. They don't want to be challenged in that aspect. They don't want to be galvanized. And so really understanding where your team members are, and for those 5 people who are frustrated with galvanizing, knowing that it's not a direct target, this is just a stage of work that has to get done, is really, really critical for that team to have cohesion, synergy, and harmony and be able to execute on the ideas of which they've discerned. But again, looking at enablement and tenacity would tell me that just by a look of this, they struggle getting work done. And if we think of productivity as not just spinning our wheels and coming up with ideas and like moving on them, but actually seeing it through completion, they're not getting the outcomes that they intended or hoped because they don't have enough people working through the finish line. So what Xandra and I work on with teams is identifying what their team map looks like, and then what is the action plan? How do we compensate for having gaps in this team map? Right? What is the action plan? And it looks different for every team, but there's a few different resources in which we execute with a team to make sure that they have a really good game plan and don't skip these areas so that they see the positive outcomes. I'll give you another quick example because I had one team that didn't have anybody. It was a 12-person leadership team, big team, right? They didn't have one single person who had the genius of wonder. And so that to me instantly stalled efficiency because nobody was asking the question of, should we be doing this a different way? Why do we have 12 meetings on the same topic? What if we tried X, Y, or Z? And so what happened is we might be coming up with ideas to the wrong question. And so we're discerning ideas that came from somewhere else that were not appropriate for the functionality of the team. And so we're coming up with these ideas where they were not responding to what the needs were of the environment or the situation or the product process. So it's very fascinating to see how everybody's team, it looks a little bit different. But that was definitely an area we had to come up with a distinct action plan for that team so that they didn't skip that area, especially when you come to strategic planning meetings. These are extremely high level, high altitudes is what we would say, right, Xandra? We'd say high altitude meetings where it is your 50,000 foot view of where you're going in the next 12 months. And if we don't have anyone in wonder or invention at those meetings, we're missing an opportunity to really plan high level and be creative for executing in the next 12 months. So this too is another area that we get into with our clients on how do we maximize our meetings that we're having, our time at our meetings. Maybe we can reduce the meetings if we're actually having them appropriately based on the different geniuses and the different altitudes of which the geniuses are looking at a project or an issue from, right? Because if we think about altitudes being really high, wonder's really, really high, looking at a 50,000 foot view. When you get down to the nitty gritty, tenacity is running it through the finish line at the 12-foot view, basically, right? And so this is an example of what a team map might look like. Xandra, do you have any comments on this or anything I might have missed?
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job explaining it. I think this is like a very superficial layer of how this can impact a team. Like you alluded to it, Lacey, right? It can impact the altitude of a meeting, right? Like who should be included in a meeting, who shouldn't be included in a meeting. And when a framework like this, and like this is not the end all be all solution, but as an example, when a framework like this is adopted amongst a team, it provides a common language, it provides a way to communicate. And if it's a meeting that is primarily for ideation, right? It's those first stages of wonder and invention. Maybe we don't need some of the folks that are really strong in discernment, right? Like we're not there yet. So if we've got the team, they're coming up with ideas, and then we've got like this corner of the group that is poking holes in all the idea. Like we're not even there yet. Like let's just throw all the noodles on the wall before we decide what sticks and what doesn't. Just having that knowledge and that understanding of who we can pull in to the right discussions at the right time, or maybe it really is, oh, let's pull in Brandy for 5 minutes. Like we're just going to borrow her genius for 5 minutes because that's really what we need. Maybe Brandy doesn't have to sit in an hour-long meeting because her genius isn't really thriving there. She's probably going to be bored out of her mind. Being able to understand that and have those discussions openly, and it's not about hiding information or being guarded or wanting to exclude people. It's really like, what is more productive? What's going to make the most sense? Where are you actually going to thrive? I think that's another really good application of this framework. But in terms of like the concept of it and the mapping, I think like you've hit all the nails on the head there, Lacey.
Love it. I will give an example. At a previous company I was at, we created a new service line, and we had to think about, I was in marketing at the time, and we had to think about what did we want to name this service line. So we had brainstorming sessions all day and night. The executive leadership team, we would get together, and we had like probably 4 meetings. And finally, the last meeting, our COO was like, we are going to stay here till 8 o'clock at night if that is what it takes for us to come up with a name for this service line. And I'm like, cool, like I'm in, I'll spend the night. I love brainstorming. And what I found out from that, looking back in hindsight, because I didn't have the vernacular for it that I do today, thanks to the working genius concept. But at that time, we had everyone on the executive leadership team attending these brainstorming sessions when it wasn't in their wheelhouse, and caused them stress and anxiety to be there because they didn't love it. Just like my girlfriend who, a friend of mine who, she doesn't love brainstorming, but she really loves tenacity. If she were in that meeting, she would have not loved it, come out drained, and we may not have gotten the outcomes that we wanted or intended because we didn't have the right people at the table. And so that to me was a learning experience and an example of how to pull in geniuses that you need for certain meetings or during different stages of the model, and when to give back and when to adjust your own geniuses. So that was an example that always sits in the back of my head of, gosh, we did it a service to her and to some of the other team members and to ourselves. It took us a lot longer to come up with the outcome that we needed when we probably could have been more efficient in the beginning by having the right people in the right meetings. So that actually takes me into the next slide. And I will say this is probably my absolute favorite, and it's super simple. But I think we, just as humans in the world, often have guilt, question ourselves. We have self-doubt. We work on confidence. Confidence comes natural for some people. For others, it doesn't come natural. And I alluded to this and mentioned it early on in this presentation, but the cool part about this model is that it reduces and potentially removes that guilt that you put on yourself internally of, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough because I struggle to see things through to the finish line. Or Sally over here comes up with all these ideas and I don't know how. I can't do that. And so we stop shooting on ourselves and stop blaming ourselves and stop guilting ourselves. And we start accepting ourselves of who we are, because we do have gifts. We do have geniuses. They look different. And I will tell you that middle activation piece, the discernment and galvanizing, are often the most overlooked stages, because we give credit to those that come up with the ideas and we give credit to those people who actually implement the ideas. but the actual work happens on all 6 stages. And so once we recognize that, it helps us to remove a lot of that guilt that we feel internally about ourselves. And probably equally as important, removes the judgment that we have on our team members. So it's easy to do the same thing on other people. Well, she doesn't contribute any ideas to this meeting. I never hear her speak up, or she never even finishes what she started. She came up with something, but she can't see it through the finish line. And how quick we are to judge other people for things that we expect them to have. And it does mirror the fundamental attribution error that we often will see in everyday life, whether it's work or home or personal life. The fundamental attribution error is essentially, I'm assigning your behavior to a personality flaw that you have, right? So let's say I'm driving to work. I'm driving to work one day and this person cuts in front of me and slams on their brake. And I'm like, oh gosh, that person is a jerk, right? And I make all sorts of assumptions about them based on who they are. That person is terrible, they're rude, they don't care about anybody else. Now, I do the same thing, and I'm trying to get in. I'm rushing. I'm trying to get my kids to daycare on time. This is the last turn and cut off for me, so I got to get in as fast as I can, and I brake because there's a car in front of me. And when I do it, it's because, well, there are circumstances outside of my own life that caused me to be that way. I'm running late, or the traffic was built up, or I'm going to get fired if I'm late one more day at work, right? And it's not a personality flaw that I have, it is just circumstances. And so we assign that to ourselves, but yet we judge other people. And so the more, again, we know about our team members and ourselves, it can really reduce, if not remove, that judgment of other people. And all of that works towards the basic foundation of a functional team, which is trust. We have to know each other to fully trust each other. And then you get to the other stacking portions of the pyramid of the 5 functions of a team. Trust is at the very, very bottom. And this model helps to help orchestrate that as well. So Xandra, I'll let you close us out.
Yeah, no, awesome. I love it. This is also my favorite part on the guilt and judgment. So of course I need to chime in, which is the way that I applied it in my own circumstance is one of my geniuses is discernment, right? I am not skilled in coming up with all of the great ideas. So something that would happen to me quite often would be, somebody would offer an idea and be like, oh, but what about this? And what about that? And poke all the holes all day long, right? And that could be seen as a very negative thing, right? Like, why is she always criticizing? A comeback that I would get often, and I didn't really have a way to respond to it, was like, well, do you have a better idea? Well, no, I don't have a better idea because that's not how my brain works. Like, I don't come up with the great ideas. I help you refine your ideas to be better. And so knowing that about myself, number one, I can recognize it. I can also communicate it to other people, right? To say is like, no, like you're actually really good at coming up with all of these ideas, whether or not they'll work or not. Like, let's not worry about that. Let's just verbal vomit all the ideas and then we can narrow them down and I can help you with that. But without that awareness of either myself or communicating that to someone else, like that's a perfect example of where there's not synergy and there is friction within a team that looking at it through a different lens could be the difference between being really productive and effective and just having a bunch of frustration and getting stuck at a certain stage. So I'm with you, Lacey. Like this is one of the best applications for sure. All righty. So as we wrap up here, hopefully you've been able to pick up on a lot of little nuggets. Both Lacey and I, as you can tell, have a good amount of passion and interest for this concept of the working genius and how it can be applied. But really at the heart of it is it's really simple, right? Which, like I mentioned earlier, is simplicity is key. It's one of my favorite things, especially when there's a lot of depth to it. So understanding ourselves, understanding the people that we work with are key, because once we have that, we have a framework to communicate, to have more productive meetings, to be able to collaborate, to know when I should be included in something, should not be included in something, why it won't rub me the wrong way. It won't hurt my feelings if I'm excluded from something because I probably don't want to be a part of it anyway. There's magic in that, right? And part of it is education, part of it is the awareness, the application. Because honestly, like I am like a personal development junkie. I love listening to podcasts and reading books and all those things. It does 0% of improvement for me if I don't do anything with that knowledge. So you might have picked up on some nuggets here, right? Like, oh, that's great information. But if that's where it stays, if right here in this webinar is where it stays and there's no action around it, then it won't really be transformative. But if this is something that you know that can impact your team, that would be helpful for you, that is really where Lacey and I love to help teams, whether it's virtually or on site. We offer a variety of services that can help with that. There's some QR codes there that you're more than welcome to scan. We've got our contact info in there. The session will be recorded. I'll need to find out the dynamics of where the recorded session can be shared, but you can feel free to email either one of us to get a copy. And I'll post something in the notes on LinkedIn. Lacey, anything that you want to add?
No, I think this was a great session. If you have any questions, regardless of what they are, we are happy to walk through and answer any questions that you might have. Notice nothing's in the chat right now, but I know a lot of you are on your phone or driving. So we will expect to hear from you at another time if you do have questions. Reem, thank you so much for the comment. I'm glad, Kirsten, that you found that to be helpful as well. And we look forward to continuing conversation as needed.
Thank you,
Thanks all.
everyone. I will stop sharing and stop recording. Thank you, everyone.